Storms flood the streets of Springfield, while inside the Capitol, lawmakers flood the budget with red ink. We've got your end of session wrap-up special next on Capitol View. Hello and welcome back to Capitol View. I'm your co-host this week, John Patterson from the Arlington Heights Daily Herald. We've had an interesting end of session at the Capitol, and joining me this week to help me host and go through it is my counterpart, Bernie Schoenburg from the State Journal-Register. Bernie, thanks for joining me or for sharing the duties this week.
We haven't done this together in a long time, so nice to see you, John.
We have not, so we'll kind of just go back and forth and try not to talk over each other too much, unless Bernie's wrong and I'm right, which will probably be the case.
It happens a lot.
So what we had happen was the lawmakers came back to Springfield. They took care of the budget in their minds, and they've left town and may or may not come back until November. The key component, of course, was the budget, which is what this session was all about, and it is admittedly not balanced. The House Speaker Mike Madigan, in talking to reporters, said, no, it's not balanced. There's $3.7 billion for a pension contribution that no one quite knows where the money will come from. There was a plan to borrow for it that ended up not getting voted on in the Senate because they didn't have support. And so the governor has basically been given this budget and said, you deal with it. And here's some extra powers to try to work it out. So Bernie, you can start filling in the details. And we'll go from there.
Yeah, and of course, one of the big stories in Illinois for years has been how underfunded the pension system is. Now, this doesn't really affect day-to-day operations, and it doesn't affect current pensioners right away because there's, billions of dollars. I think it's in the neighborhood of 30 in the major pension plans, and that just might be one of them. But state employees who are retired are going to get their pay, which, some argue is high and some is low. I guess the high-end folks get a lot of pension, and they get usually all of their health care paid, which is another controversy. But the key is that actuarially, to make all of the accountants happy and to make those who issue bonds for Illinois happy, to get everything set, you want the pension system solid enough to last for in perpetuity. 50 years from now, everybody's going to get the money they need. That's why even before this week, the legislature changed future pension benefits for future workers to lower them, to make you work longer and get less pension payout at the end. That, as Quinn will Crow, saved hundreds of billions of dollars over decades. However, they have a scheduled payment this year and they were trying to borrow $3.7 billion because that frees up that money, even though they're borrowing on borrowing because the state is so far in debt and there's like a $13 billion deficit. But he needed $3.7 billion from the legislature, borrowing authority, because then you can use that other money to try to fill some of the gaps, pay some of the states behind due bills, and get that done. And what was interesting is, if there's been one criticism of Pat Quinn through the entire year and a little more that he's been governor, it's getting the hard stuff done. It didn't look like he could get the hard stuff done. Last year he couldn't get the tax increase he wanted. This year he didn't get the tax increase he wanted. But when the House voted earlier last week for the pension borrowing, and Quinn was on the floor and came on the floor to glare at Tom Cross, the House Republican leader, as he was talking about how bad this whole idea was, but they got 2 Republican votes, that made it look like something had happened, and Governor Pat Quinn finally was able to get the legislature to do what he wanted. Unfortunately, just a couple days later, when it went over to the Senate, where there were 36 Democrats, 37, when they're all here, and what do they need? 36 votes to pass the extraordinary majority needed to approve borrowing. They didn't have the votes. I think a couple of guys were out of town, and some people didn't like it, and the Republicans held firm in the Senate, so they left town without authorizing that borrowing, and that just returns to the idea that, well, can Quinn get it done even with his own party in charge? And it's interesting. And so while they didn't give him the authority to borrow to make the pension payment, they also didn't give him the authority to skip it. Because there was the Senate had approved a backup plan that basically told the governor,
you have to make the pension payment, but when you make it is up to you. And you can make it, and you don't have to make it until you have the money in the account to do so. So that could be next week, or it could be next May. The problem for the pension systems is then, it's kind of like your boss telling you, we're not going to cut your pay, but we're not going to pay you for 6 months. Yeah. So how you get through the next 6 months is up to you. And that would be the pension systems would have to sell off assets in order to make their payments. And then they end up further behind and making the situation worse. But that plan didn't go anywhere in the House. And so Quinn is stuck with a legally required pension payment of $3.7 billion and no explicit way to pay for it and no explicit way to skip it. And so then that's when it starts competing with school funding and prison funding and funding for everything else that he has to also pay for, and figuring out, okay, where do I get the money and how do I move it around? And
right.
We are $13 billion in the hole
right.
meanwhile.
Right. Now, the thing about this pension problem is it's not necessarily done because the Senate could come back. But I don't know how strong that feeling is, and it depends how much arm twisting can be done or arranging can be done in the off season when everybody's back to their home districts to get enough Democrats on board and maybe a Republican or two to then call them back into session and get this done. Tell me if I'm wrong. That the end of May deadline to get general legislation done before an extraordinary majority kicks in, I don't think really applies here because the borrowing takes an extraordinary majority Correct. Anyway. So anytime between now and the election, they can come back sometime in the summer on this borrowing plan, meet for a day and have the Senate vote for what the House already voted for, and then it would go through and then the state could borrow. Of course, even passage of that legislation means then the administration has to, do the actual borrowing, go through the fiscal steps necessary to put those bonds or whatever on the market. So we'll see. It is odd that we have these crises in state government, and this is a continuing crisis because so many people who get paid by the state and provide services are not being paid. Some of them are going out of business, some of them are borrowing, which is another way the state is in debt to them. You still, when this is, if they end up getting the Senate to approve the pension thing, maybe people will forget how terrible the situation was. But if this lasts through the election, then it continues to be an issue for Quinn, who is facing, of course, his main opponent, Bill Brady, the Republican, who didn't want borrowing anyway. So I'm not sure where that leaves everything, except Brady can say, oh, look, the administration is in terrible shape. And Quinn can say, well, it's because Brady didn't let me borrow. And when we needed to, and a lot of people said it was necessary. So very difficult and convoluted situation, and not really good for anybody.
I think what will ultimately happen, I don't think they will come back. I think that the out for the administration in this is that they gave Governor Quinn, the lawmakers gave Quinn emergency budget powers. And one of them allows him to go into these special state accounts that are set aside for special purposes, and many of them have surpluses. They say there's $6 billion in there, and the administration says they want to use $1 billion out of that won't impede anybody's operations for these funds. However, the law that they passed doesn't put a limit on how much he can take. And in talking with one of the Senate budget point people, he said that there could be $2 to $3 billion in surpluses there at any given time. So in theory, the governor may have another $1 billion to $2 billion that he could tap into that perhaps make the pension payment or make the first half of the pension payments and get you past the election. And I think there's going to be a lot more maneuvering.
Right. And of course, using the money from those funds got to be called fund sweeps during the 6 glorious years of Governor Blagojevich. And there was a horrible spin put on it, partly because it was Blagojevich and people looked for reasons to dislike him. With Quinn, he still, I think, public relations-wise, has a more appeal that he's at least trying to do the right thing in a bad situation, maybe not getting it done, but I don't think people view him, at least people on his side of the aisle, on the Democratic side, certainly don't view him as sinister, whereas everybody thought Blagojevich was sinister. So the fund sweeps were a terrible thing and yielded lawsuits. Maybe some of that will happen anyway, but he'll probably get somewhat more of a pass from the folks in the system.
So Bernie sets me up with turmoil within parties. We'll go into a little more detail here on how the borrowing plan got passed in the House. And while it didn't go anywhere in the Senate, there was some interesting politics happening on the Republican side of the aisle. The proposal needed 71 votes in the House. This was to borrow the $3.7 billion for pension payments. Needed 71 votes. The House Democrats have 70, but Jack Franks from Marengo up in the suburbs was a no vote all along, and so they needed to find 2 Republicans. And ultimately, on the final vote, Bill Black from Danville voted for it, and he had voted for it before and had made no secret that he was going to, but suddenly Bob Biggins from Elmhurst in the suburbs was a yes vote.
Those are far suburbs, by the way. I'm from Evanston, that's a suburbod.
No,
Elmhurst and Marengo are way out, but anyway.
But Bob Biggins from DuPage County had voted no on a first version of it, and then suddenly
that's right.
came
Elmhurst
up
is close.
as a yes, and suddenly everyone was angry at Biggins. The thing that Biggins
every Republican.
Yes, the thing that Biggins and Black have in common is neither of them is seeking re-election, so they will not be coming back to Springfield next year. Biggins defended his vote, saying he thought it was the right thing to do. He was frustrated with Republican leadership, which he said wasn't. He used a lot of Democratic buzzwords in saying that the Republican leaders weren't working with Democrats, and that it was of the bad choices being presented, it was the least bad choice. He, during a Republican caucus meeting to talk about trying to hold all their members together in opposition, he didn't show up for it, and apparently went and had a meeting with the governor's chief of staff. They claimed that there were no promises made, and in the end, it apparently was for naught, as the Senate couldn't do anything with it anyway.
Well, it was a victory for a day for the Quinn administration. But of course, the interesting part, which you ended up writing about in your paper, was that when Quinn was asked by reporters if he had given anything to Bob Biggins or promised anything, he said absolutely not. In fact, we're good buddies. In fact, I saved his life once. Why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, that was a classic Quinn-ism. So yes, Quinn was asked, so if you're reelected, does this mean you will never give Bob Biggins a job? And he never did answer that question, and instead he launched into the story of how once a few years ago he walked into one of the government buildings
City Hall in Chicago,
yeah, City Hall in Chicago, and found Bob Biggins collapsed on the floor having a stroke, and was the first to call 911. And so I'm trying to get a grasp on that, and I went up to the House floor and got Biggins to come down, and he confirmed, well, he said that's what he had been told because he was the one having the stroke and didn't really recall, but that he was told that Quinn was one of the first 2 people to come upon him and was the only one with a cell phone and called 911, and Biggins credits his recovery to the fast medical attention that he received. He claims that story did not come up during his meeting with the governor's staff, but it appears that perhaps if there was a favor being returned, that might have been it.
Yeah, well, it does put a human face on the people we're talking about, doesn't it?
So I was expecting Quinn to buy the Senate Republicans very fatty fried lunches for the pension vote, seeing if perhaps he couldn't save someone's life there, but that didn't
Let's
happen.
not even talk about Raymond Poe feeding everybody chicken. Oh no, that was just House members.
But it was interesting. Biggins has been ostracized by the Republicans. When he was talking to reporters after the vote, a lawmaker one of his colleagues walked by and said something we can't repeat because this is a family show on a family network. And apparently he's not welcome in the Republican caucus anymore. He claims that he will not resign the seat. He plans to serve out his term. On the other hand, Bill Black continues to be a functioning Republican member, and while I'm sure there were a few harsh words. Ron Stevens of a Southern Illinois Republican took a pretty good dig at Black, saying if you want to go out a hero, you should be doing something else. And that was clearly targeted at Black, but that's about the only criticism he took.
Well, Bill
publicly.
Black, I mean, who has almost retired from the House a few times or announced it, I think is finally doing so, has been a chief spokesman for their side for a long time and a well-liked person. So it is, and Biggins is not that much of a vocal member of the legislature that those of us not from his territory would have heard from as often. But I think those kinds of hurts go away over time. It is interesting how severe Tom Cross and the Republican side, working basically in concert with Bill Brady, their candidate for governor, state senator from Bloomington, have tried to hold the line on certain things, including, you know, not putting adequate votes on borrowing, for example, to give Pat Quinn what he wants. There are those, certainly some who sit in this chair, like Charlie Wheeler, professor at University of Illinois at Springfield, who will say, you know, it's not really responsible, in a sense, either side, because votes are there for most things, not borrowing in the House, but just for simple majority things like passing a tax increase. Things are not getting done for political reasons, and that political curtain over things is really hurting the providers and the people who are served by those providers of the state. So we'll see if responsibility, at least as viewed by many, kicks in at some point and enough money is provided to provide state services, or more devastating or difficult cuts are coming, and more people are being affected by this, school districts included.
I was going to note for Bill Black, he does have a history of being kind of the maverick Republican or rogue Republican. I'm going to put, he was the, for Governor Edgar's attempt to overhaul school funding, which largely went against his own party's wishes because it had tax increases in it. In the late 90s, Bill Black was the co-sponsor on the Republican side, along with the Democratic leader Barbara Flynn Curry at the time. So.
And that would probably be the Jim Edgar plan that was very much like the Dawn Clark Netsch plan, yes, that Jim Edgar ran against, saying she wanted to raise your taxes 42%, but that's history. Things do move on when you get into office and see what the problems are. And you know, the disparities in school funding in the 30-plus years that I've been around here, and I think you've been here a significant portion of that, has always been, you know, the problem that Illinois doesn't have a way to get school funding as equal as it should be from poor districts to rich districts, because so much of school funding is paid for by property taxes. So it depends on the property tax base where you live as to how much money your schools are and what kind of equipment and teachers they can have. Not that you can't, some good teachers in the schools with less money, but schools with more money obviously have more options. And I think even the Oprah show just recently did another story or one on, you know, look at Neuqua Valley, I think one of the big suburban high schools versus one of the inner city Chicago schools, and the differences, the stark differences of the opportunities there. And then this is actually a nationwide problem, but it's one that Illinois continues to have.
It's among our many problems that we can not address. For the budget, it's not all complete doom and gloom, I suppose. For the lawmakers did take a little bit of the pain themselves. The deal that was passed requires 12 furlough days for lawmakers and state officials. They lose a cost of living raise, and their mileage reimbursements and hotel and meal money are cut. And I suppose for taxpayers, while the state really can't afford it, critics would say there is a back-to-school sales tax holiday that will take the state's portion of the sales tax off in early to mid-August, so that people can save a little bit of money buying clothes, computer accessories, and other back-to-school supplies. It'll
be a little bit of help. It'll get people in the stores. I think the retailers should like it.
But the campaign should like it.
The campaign should like it. I think it's going to cost the state, if I read somewhere, about $50 million in lost tax revenue. But you know, I assume the hope is that it will be made up in other ways with other purchases made at that time, and enthusiasm for shopping, which you know, even the unemployment rate is down a little bit in Illinois, although it's still bad. But I know Springfield's is down from about 10% to about 8.5% just in the last month. So, you know, statewide, things are moving slowly in the right direction, at least employment situation, but it's still not great.
Also approved was a plan to, a tax amnesty plan to encourage tax cheats to pay up with no penalties, and that's been, you know, kind of a volleyballed back and forth by the two sides, depending on what you need it to pay for, and ultimately they threw that in there because they probably needed somebody's vote. Mm-hmm. Speaker Madigan said he wasn't thrilled to be helping tax cheats, but they put it in there anyway.
And yeah, and this comes along every few years, and I guess it generates what, $200 or $300 million, yep. Which again sounds like a whole lot of money to us peons, but when you're talking, you know, several billion in the hole in the state and delayed payments to so many people, I guess every little bit helps.
And then in general, the budget is pretty much exactly the same as it was last year. The education funding is just about the same, and it was passed in large lump sums and sent to Quinn, and then he's supposed to figure out how do you make it work. You're $13 billion in the hole. I got to move stuff around, delay payments. It's going to count on carrying over more than $6 billion in payments again, which is what they headed into this year with. So if you're waiting for the state to pay you, you'll be waiting another year because there's going to be another $10 billion plus deficit when they come around to do this next budget.
Yeah, and to me that it sounds a little bit like, I mean, obviously you have to prioritize, and so you'll use the money you have to put out fires as they erupt. Or like the whack-a-mole situation. We have a problem here, send some money to it, and they obviously have to work with the comptroller's office to do that. But it sounds almost like, if you want to do conspiracy theory, the 6-month budget idea, where there's only about half as much money as they really need to spend, so let Quinn spend it where he needs it. Maybe after the election, the legislature will do what they have traditionally done over the last 30 years in really bad times, which is bite the bullet and pass some sort of revenue enhancer tax increase. After the election, although given the fact that there are constant elections now and legislators are scared of voters more and thinking perhaps more of the next election, even though it's 2 years away, because even when they get in a new term, it's less than a year before they have to file for the next term if they're in the House, because it's every 2 years. And everybody's going to do that next time because they're going to do the remap after the census. We're going to have new House and Senate districts, so everybody's going to be up for election in 2 years, which may make it harder than usual to get something like a tax increase done even after the election this year.
And the interesting thing for the emergency powers that they gave Quinn that adds a bit of political intrigue to it is that they are only good for 6 months. They somehow magically expire just before the next governor is sworn in. So all this power to move money around and to withhold money from agencies in order to make cash flow work. I think it expires either the day or the day of that the next, or it's right about the time that the next governor would be sworn in. So
well, Bill Brady says he wants the power to be governor, and the polls have been in his favor so far. I have said before on this program that I think Brady will lose some points in the polls as more of his social stands that I think are more conservative than kind of the mainstream of Illinois. Certainly folks in the Chicago area who don't pay that much attention until maybe they get hit over the head with advertisements near the election. He'll lose some points there, but as an alternative to Quinn, who is getting bashed regularly, for example, in the Tribune editorial page, oh my gosh, they don't like his tax ideas, I don't think they like his borrowing ideas, it's very weird, and that's a pretty strong force in the Chicago area, other than the Arlington Heights Daily Herald, which I know is everybody's top choice for opinion.
Absolutely.
But Quinn's getting a lot of bad publicity just because he and his party are in charge, and Brady is an alternative. If he gets in, if those polls hold up in his direction, and he's talked about cutting state government another 10%, and bringing back hundreds of thousands of jobs to Illinois, which will generate the tax income that will pay for all of these programs that we have and cut the programs we don't need. We're not sure what those are yet. I mean, he has made, Medicaid needs to be cut and everybody put in managed care. He will give you some ideas, but even the specific implementation of those ideas is difficult and may take a whole lot more time than, magically making $6 billion or $10 billion appear. But yes, he could get saddled with less power to mess with what's there and power to oversee the entire system and see if he can implement his ideas.
Since we're talking about the governor's race, the race is pretty much on. We already have, the latest would be there was a media report, I believe, in the Tribune about a questionable, actually I believe it came out of Crane's Chicago Business perhaps first. But anyway, I didn't have it first. That Governor Quinn's campaign has taken campaign donations from the Teamsters who didn't like the way that the McCormick Place reform was shaping up, and lo and behold, Quinn mandatorily vetoed that, although the lawmakers quickly overrode him. But so Bill Brady is asking for the Attorney General to investigate.
Lisa Madigan, the daughter of the Speaker of the House. It's a small state. $75,000 in a couple of donations from the Teamsters, And then as Quinn, this was quite a major defeat for Quinn, I think, this last week. It was quite interesting. They had a press conference to announce the four basic kinds of changes he was putting in the bill that would change how McCormick Place works. They, of course, get trade shows from all over the country. Those who put on the trade shows have complained for years that particularly union contracts make it too expensive to do business there. You know, if you want to put in a plug, the electrician has to do it for an hourly wage, and you have to get your food from certain suppliers, and you know, they talk about a case of Pepsi or something that would cost $250. I might be exaggerating, but I don't think so. You know, if you want it brought to your little location. So one of the changes Quinn made was to reduce the number of unions from, I guess, 4 to 2 as major unions that people would have to deal with, but the Teamsters would have folded into them some of the other workers, which apparently is something the Teamsters wanted. So the question is Quinn doing that in exchange for $75,000 in donations, a la Blagojevich? His people adamantly say, no, nothing to do with it. But it is the kind of thing that a Bill Brady, who wants to run against, you know, the Democratic leadership of recent years, will certainly use to his advantage and see if he can get there. As we sit here doing this show, I'm not sure what the Attorney General's reaction is going to be. It's really hard to prove over time a definite quid pro quo unless something was said or is on tape, a la Blagojevich, saying, you do this for me and I'll do this for you. And that's been a problem. That's why new campaign contribution limits were put in the law after Blagojevich, but they don't take effect until after this election. So that's why you can still get, you know, $75,000 from one strong union, and these questions get raised, and then your actions are questioned. But unless there's something on tape, it's really hard to prove criminal activity, because for years, big organizations, business and labor, have given big contributions to candidates for governor in Illinois. The governor's actions always affect those unions or businesses one way or another, and it's really hard to prove criminality unless you have something in writing or on tape.
And with that, we are out of time for this week's Capitol View. I really appreciate Bernie co-hosting along, and please tune in next time for another Capitol View, and we'll see if any of the problems have ever been solved.